All right, so as a kind of saying it once again, we're going to be going through Lesson 3 examples. And that can be found on this GitHub link, Launch Code Education, Angular LC 101-projects, and then finding your way through Lesson 3, finding your way to examples. So let's look at what this project is. This is that exact repo that we pointed out. It's examples, right? And this is like the structure of an Angular project. And so you've gone over this the last 2 class periods, how an Angular project is structured. All Angular projects, they stem from this app component. This app component HTML, app module, and app component.css. Like those are the 4 main bones of the Angular project. And then from there, everything else is going to be nested under those. So what does the app module do? All right, we'll go over it. The app module as a piece is saying here is all the pieces, here are all like the classes and the pieces that I'm going to write. And if I want to bundle them in my application, if I want them to be available, I'm going to write them and then I'm going to import them into this app module. So if we add a component, like here is a skill set component, if say we add like another list component, we have to come back here and add in app module and we have to actually add it here, or else that code's not going to be available. So the app module is just bundling all your pieces of JavaScript, of TypeScript, into one piece. And then this app component TS, app component HTML, and app component CSS, that's your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript for your first page or your kind of like outside page of your application. So in this case, if we open it up, by navigating into the folder and running ngserve, what Angular does in this time that it takes to load is it looks in your app module and it says, what all pieces do I need? And it goes and grabs those pieces and it bundles them together and it shoves the app component on the screen. Like that's what it's doing. That's why it's taking so long. Whereas when you had like your index.html and you just opened it up, that was immediate because all you're doing is open up one file. Adding a framework like Angular, or other words you'll hear about like React and Vue, they're doing a whole lot of bundling and shoving together and really complex stuff. And that's one of the reasons why it makes debugging and figuring out problems sometimes a little difficult, because you're working through like layers and layers of stuff that's going on. So once it says, hey, you've compiled, you've brought all these things together, you can navigate to the default Angular survey, which is this localhost 4200. And this localhost 4200 is going to show us our app component.ts, which is our app component.ts. We're saying, hey, here's the HTML page that I'm going to show on my app component.ts. So this HTML should be showing on the screen. Now I'm pretty sure it's not, so we're actually starting with a broken web page. This will be kind of a cool exploration, like what's going on? Why is it broken? It'll be an exploration together because I did not plan this. Okay, I was doing an example for a button. Somebody had a question, and I have an error somewhere in there. But because it's not relevant to today's class, we're going to delete it. And this is the example they kind of walked through in the book, where on the left side, we have these buttons, of which you're supposed to be able to do things to them, activate them, deactivate them. And on the right side, we have coding skills. We have some coding skills I know, and then we have a copy of that skill list. And so let's find out in our Angular code where all this stuff is coming from. So I'm going to open up appcomponent.html. Now, why is this appcomponent.html showing up on the screen? Is it because it's named the same? Is it because it just always knows to look for appcomponent.html? Like, why is this h2 attribute directives, like why is that showing up on the screen? Well, app root is the first tag on the index page, which is our app component.ts, but how does our app component.ts, why is that showing it up? Say that again?
Go to the app root HTML. Is there another one out there?
I think app root is just saying I'm going to shove in whatever's here. The really thing I want to say is that it's actually specifying it here. So the first thing I'm saying is, hey, I'm going to load app component.ts, and then your TypeScript file is actually saying what you're going to put in there. Now it's important to kind of understand and dissect these components because I can just as easy say, you know what, I don't want to show that. I think that's kind of silly. Instead, I just want to show something different. So the only stuff that's tying these two components together is that you're actually saying, hey, when I show this component, go and get me this HTML and then shove that HTML on the page there. But in all your components, you're actually explicitly saying this is the HTML to go and find. And the reason I say that, it's the same as CSS, because at the end of the day, you're just writing HTML and CSS and TypeScript. And it's a little confusing in Angular because it's all bound together and it gets really cobwebby. But you could literally just type it in line just like this. Or you could type it in a file and say, you know what, put that file in there instead. So in this case, we have a file. We're saying, hey, for our template, for what to show to the screen, go get this app component HTML. And there, it's already back on the screen. It's hot refreshing. Okay, so this app component has a div, which is a container, and then on one side of the div, it has a set of buttons. And then on the other side of the div, it has a skill set. So then I'll look back to the page, and that means this is the buttons over here, and here is my skill set. And if I right-click and inspect, yep, here's my skill set. And then somewhere up here should be my buttons. Okay, so both of those Angular components are actually on the HTML page now. So let's dive into skill set. So skill set component is saying, this is what I'm going to put to the screen. I'm going to put all of my skills to the screen. And I'm going to put a heading there, which is an attribute, which I'm getting. And then I'm going to list all of these skills out. So ng4 is like an Angular way of displaying a list to the screen that we learned last class. So I'm going to put all these skills. And then here in line 7 through 11, it looks darn near the exact same almost to me that the other one does, where it's saying, hey, I have a copy of the skill list, and then I'm going to list all these skills out. And then here is some practice test. So yeah, that's exactly what it is there. Why is it green? If I look why it's green, well, it's CSS, so it's either inline CSS, and I don't see any inline CSS, or it's here in this CSS file. And there it is. It's saying, hey, everything inside my skills class, I want to make green. So there, now I've kind of understood the application. I've walked through it step by step to where are all these things on the page coming from before I've started to actually build something. So I tried to understand it first. Now let's build something. And try to make it a little easier, I created this to-do list of things we want to do. Let's refactor skill set to make it a smaller component, because it's like a skill set, but it's having two different types of lists, right? So let's make that into its own thing. So what would be a good name for an individual component if we wanted to wrap this component and this component in their own smaller pieces, right? Everything in Angular is about building smaller pieces. Maybe like skill list. Because a skill set could be a whole bunch of lists where you could have 20 different lists of different things, and then maybe each individual list you want to be something different. Okay, so let's create a component. So in Angular, you can generate a component by the ng-gc command, which is shorthand for ng generate component. Both will work. And then you just name your component. And it says, hey, I created these files. I created the CSS, the HTML, the TypeScript, and the spec file for this class. I also, and this is not a minor one to be overlooked, I went in and I added this new component to your app module. So it's going to get bundled for you. So for some of you who are like just right-clicking and saying, I just want to create this HTML and create this CSS, if you don't also add it to your app module, it's never going to show up in your application. You'll never be able to use it. So now we have it. Here is our skill list. So now what we're going to try to refactor is we're going to try to bring in the logic from skill set, and we're going to try to bring it in to skill list. Because skill set doesn't need to be doing two different things here. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just include, first I'm going to look, how do I know what to write here? Do I just write skill list? How do I know what to write?
There's a pattern, is it app-skill-list?
There is a pattern, but you're still making an assumption that I'm following the pattern, right?
When you use the ng-generate, doesn't it automatically follow a pattern? If you want to change it, you have to manually change it from the pattern?
Yes.
So,
But in this case, say you're coming into someone else's code base, how do you actually know? You can go to this component and say, hey, I want to include this component, and this selector here is what you have to be in here. And the reason I say that is if you look at the code that LaunchCode provided here, it's actually not following the convention. So they actually did break convention there and named it just skill set instead of app skill set. So what we want to include here is app skill list. So we'll go into our HTML, and we're just going to include app skill list, which is a whole new, declaration. And what should show up there is our skill list. And our skill list, if we're going to predict what shows up there, is literally just saying skill list works. So we should see that on the screen. Now, are we going to? Yeah, it actually does. Skill list works. It's showing there up on the screen. So now we're going to move this list functionality into our skill list. So what we want to do is create a list in similar fashion to this. And instead of copying and pasting, we can just move it in here. So every skill list, we just want to have an unordered list. And just to prove that I can actually create an unordered list, I'm just going to create it here. Boom. So then I have an ordered list, not an unordered list. Okay, so now we're able to break that list into two things. Now it's not the actual list that we want, but now that we've broken this into two lists, we're going to kind of replace all this right here and show just how it's a little more functional. So instead of all these OLs, 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 and repeating the same thing, and say we had 20 lists, we didn't want to repeat the same thing 20 times, we're just going to say, hey, you know what? We want two app skill lists back to back. And so now we have these two skill lists back to back. Now they're not our languages because we hard-coded 1, 2, 3. We're going to add our languages in there. But we've gone from having a large component with a bunch of stuff in it to like a slightly smaller component now, where now we just have a list. Okay. So what else do we need to bring from this skill set component? So in this skill set component, in line 10 is listing all these skills. It's saying here are the skills that I want to display to the screen. And so there's two ways we can bring this down to the skill list component. We can either say, you know what, I don't actually need you at this level, and I can move that all the way directly into skill list, or we can pass it down through an attribute. Which way do y'all want to do?
Let's learn the hard one.
So which one is that?
Let's pass that out through an
Okay.
attribute. Copy and cut and paste is way too easy.
So how about this then? Let's do both. Let's cut and paste, and then we'll come back and pass it down, right? That way we learn both. No, let's just do the hard one. So we have these skills in this skill set component, but we need them, so like we have access to them here, but we need them down here. We need them in this app skill list. We need them a little further down. So what we're going to do is going to pass them in by making an attribute. So we're saying, hey, there's this attribute on app skill list, and I'm calling it skills. And into that skills, I'm going to pass through, what was it called again? Oh, skills. I'm going to pass through skills. Now this is like Angular. This is Angular magic, that Angular just knows that, hey, if you write it like this and you have it in quotation marks, I know that I'm just going to go over here and pass through this down to the component. Angular just knows that. And then over here on skill list component, we're going to say, okay, you know what? Now I have a new thing. And I'm getting passed a string of skills. Now, has anybody used this input before?
No.
Okay, so this input is how you're going to pass things down components. So the question exactly of how we give it from one component to another component, the parent component, if it wants to pass it to a child component, the child component has the input on it. And then once it has that input on it, then whatever's being passed in, you can just use here in your HTML just like the other one. So we could just say, okay, I just want to see if something comes, right? I just want to say, does the first skill even like show up? Like not even to an ng4 syntax yet. Oh, loops showed up. This did not show up, but loops showed up. Why did one show up and not the other?
You didn't pass skills into the other abstract, just the first one.
But I passed it down. Shouldn't it be available?
It's only available in the one scope from that higher up HTML file.
So if I go back to skill set component, in line 3 I said, okay, I'm going to pass my skills down to my app skill list. So then, but I'm, like you just exactly said, I'm only passing it in line 3. I'm not passing it to the next one. So if I wanted to pass it to the next one, I pass it in line 4, and then there loops comes through both times. So that's just one way of refactoring it down into a smaller component. Now we're going to do a quick refresher of last class and say, okay, now that we have it in one component, how do we build this ng4 loop?
Quick question.
Yeah.
Why would you opt to do it that way and not export it as part of a class?
Say that export what as part of class?
So that variable skills, why would you not export it like you're exporting other modules? Why would you not export that skills module into your skill list or skill set?
So are you saying why don't I export this skills variable?
Yep.
It's mostly just like if you have a website, you could have like 100 different lists of things, right? So the parent gets to choose which list the child displays. And if you export it, then the child has to say, I want to import the favorite food lists, or I want to import the favorite drinks list. But if you allow the parent to pass it down, then the parent can say, oh, this person clicked here, so I'm going to give it the favorite foods. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but what it does is it makes the child dumber. So it's almost like writing a small function that doesn't know anything about the rest of the program. It just knows it's one job. Like my one job is I'm just going to put a list on the screen. And
Is that best practice then?
yes, it's best practice to have your functions as dumb as possible, because if they start knowing more stuff about the rest of the application, then when like an application changes somewhere else, then I got to change. Yeah, that's a good question. Because I could have a whole new skill list and then say, you know what, next to my skills, now I want to pass favorite foods. And I could just put something else on the screen there. Okay, so we have loops 2, 3, and it looks like those are hard-coded here. Yeah, so let's make our ng4. So with ng4 syntax in Angular, it's always written the same way, and we'll see if we can get it right the very first time. You always say ng4. Actually, hold up a second. Does the ng4 go on the li or the ol? It goes on the li because it goes on the thing that you want to repeat. It goes on the thing that you want to keep, we think about for loops. We're like, hey, you have a for loop, and then inside the for loop, you do something. So it feels like sometimes it should go on the ol, but whatever you're trying to repeat, it goes on the li. And then we could say, let skill of skills. So for every skill within the array skills, do something. Now, do these variable names matter?
No, not technically. They're just there to help you understand what it's doing. The array one I think does matter. It's the other one doesn't.
Yes, so that's what I wanted to say. One of them does not matter. One of them does matter. So this is just saying, hey, this is my new variable that I'm creating. It's every time I loop over skills, this is my new variable. But this variable name does matter. This is saying that, hey, whatever array I'm trying to loop over, that array better be available. Like that array has to be here, or else I'm not going to have anything to loop over. And then nothing's going to show up on the page. So if we change it to skills, nothing's going to show up. There's nothing in between those because there's nothing to loop over. But now if we say skills, it's going to loop through one of those. It's going to loop through that and then paste it to the screen every time. And if we wanted to just add it here, we could say, for every one of those skills, shove it on the screen. And now we have these exact two loops, and we haven't duplicated any code. Our code is the exact same. Yeah, question?
I was going to say, I guess you kind of technically duplicated code by putting the app tag in twice, but could you not just create like an ng4 and just repeat the section 2 times instead of putting the thing in there twice?
Yeah, so the question was, here in the skill set, could you do an ng4 instead of putting it in twice? Yeah, I guess you technically could, but normally on a web page, you want like a certain thing to show up in a certain place. So for something like that, I wouldn't mind putting it in.
Sure.
Because you're not normally going to list the same set of skills twice. So then yeah. But yeah, thinking like that, thinking of how to use the same code and just repeat it over again, that type of thought process is a good mindset to be focusing on. All right, oops, add and commit after this and every step. Cool. I'm glad we read that after the second step. So if I'm adding committing, and those of you who are following along, I'm assuming you're not all on master. I'm assuming you started off by checking out a branch, as is proper Git workflow. And then these are the things that I added. So I'm going to say, okay, add these. And what I did, add a message. I commented out broken code in buttons. That's what I did to start. And then I added skill list component.
How did you get it to enter in a new line without attempting to run the command? Is that shift enter?
No, it was just return. The only difference is I never closed my quotation marks.
So it just recognized not to do anything when you close it up?
Yeah. It's like some people who have probably messed up, because I did this when I was learning out Git. If you like do, let's make a change. Anybody done that yet? Or like you add the wrong quotation mark on accident and then it just keeps tabbing down and you're like, I finished it. It's just not recognizing that you finished your comment. So it's just going to keep giving you space until you comment. So now it says made a change and it'll have that other quotation mark in it. All right, number 3, line 16 on my code, my screen. When hovering over a list item, turn that text pink. So when hovering over a list item, turn that text pink. And here's one that you can do in a whole bunch of different ways. Angular kind of makes it so you can do it in a bunch of different ways. I think the book reading suggested to do it like as an attribute, right? To say, hey, am I hovering? And then set it as an attribute. As I'm looking at this, if I'm saying, okay, if I just want to hover over a list and make that pink, I would do that in CSS. So I would go to the CSS component that's the closest to the list. I could add this anywhere, but I'm going to go to the closest to the list. And I'm going to say, okay, what do I want to say? I want to say every time an li is hovered, make it pink. And then it'll be pink every time you hover over it. Now here's the really cool thing about Angular is that if there's other LIs on the page, were you all laughing about how beautiful it was? Well, this is the importance that Kelly talked about a long time ago, where if you know the basics of HTML, CSS, and TypeScript, Angular is an awesome tool. But it all comes down to these basics, right? And don't overcomplicate it. If you want to do a CSS change, try to do it mostly using CSS. Now we can do one, this next step is going to be doing one also using like a directive or using an Angular. And those can be used at different times. But what's really cool, what I like about Angular, what I think it does really well, is if I only want this hover to apply to list components in this skill list, it only will. And then if I add, let's say I add a new one, just for the sake of adding it, and I say, hey, here's my new list. And it's 1 and 2. It doesn't pink. Even though I said, hey, add it to all pink LIs. Because Angular is smart enough to know that you put it down here in skill set, like you only mean it down there in skill set. Now if I was to put that in a parent, if you put it down here in skill list, it's only in skill list. Now if you put it in a parent, let's see what happens. So the immediate parent of skill list is skill set. And so now it's not in the same component, but it's in a parent. So we're going to see what happens. So Angular is also smart enough there to say, you know what? You didn't actually mean this in this exact component. So it's kind of cool. It lets you localize your CSS instead of having like competing CSS. It's one of the reasons I like Angular. I like Angular for that reason. All right, let's do the other fun way. But because we're switching steps and switching functionality, what should we do? Yeah. Add and commit. And because we don't need to commit everything, remove that change. You see how I hit git status? So that's my way of saying, okay, what files did I change? Before just adding and committing, I'm like, what did I actually change? And then I noticed like, I changed something and I don't want to keep that really. So then I got rid of it. So So then I'm going to say git add, and for some reason it's saying I changed skill set component CSS, and I didn't think I did.
You added an empty line.
Yeah, 2 empty lines. So that's kind of an unnecessary to change to put in. So now I say git status, and I did change skill list. I do want that change. I'm going to say when it's pink, make the text, when I hover, make the text pink. All right, back to our instructions.
So you don't necessarily want to push your commits, you just want to commit frequently.
Yeah, you don't need to push your commits every time. A good rule of thumb for me is like, if somebody else is going to be working on the code with me, or if somebody else is reviewing the code, then you want to push it frequently. But if you're working entirely by yourself, or you're going to be doing this whole thing for a day, then like work on it for half a day and then push it up. Only like when you're going to take a big break. Good question.
Is there a reason why you couldn't use the management part of that in VS Code?
So the question was, is there a reason I couldn't go here and say, like, do all my Git from inside VS Code?
Yeah, because I used the little, the search icon on the left,
Yeah. So
the one underneath that.
there's not a good reason, no. You can do it either way. I think that for me, if I can do it on the command line, that means I'm not dependent on VS Code, right? I can use IntelliJ or Eclipse or Sublime or any other text editor or IDE, whereas if you only do it in VS Code, then you're kind of, dependent on VS Code. But I think either way is cool. How do I get out of this, though? This is how I would say is not a good reason to do it. No. Another CSS change. I put a question mark, but we're going to do it. Maybe change the word of functions to be a different color. So what I mean by the word of functions, I mean in line 3, functions. So let's say if the word is functions, let's make it a different color, right? That'll be fun. So let's use an attribute directive. So now we're working entirely here in skill list. And we're saying our li is this. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. I'm a fan of class name. So I'm going to say, I want my class name on every single one of these to be set based on what the skill is. So if the skill is function, then what I want to do is I want to make, if the skill is function, then I want to make the skill, then I want to make it just an informational tag, like nothing crazy. But if the skill is not, so I want to say that differently. If the skill is function, I want it to be a warning tag, which is just a made up class name, right? I'm just saying, I'm going to assign an attribute to be either warning or info.
Do you need to put the class name after the ng for loops, or does that not matter in this case?
That's a good question. I think we should figure it out together. So nothing showed up, and all we said was, hey, make the class name. If skill is equal to function, make the class name warning. If it's not, make it info. So we're going to inspect it. And it looks like they're all info. So none of them matched with function. They're all info.
Capital F would be the problem there.
I agree. So all we're checking is, hey, did that attribute get assigned correctly? And it did. It's warning, right? So that works good. And if you wanted to not worry about lowercase, or if you wanted to not worry about something, this is just JavaScript in here. So you could do something like And now I only care about this, and so we still have a warning class. It's tough to see this over here in the back, but all of these classes here are info, info, warning, info, 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 info. And it's the same thing down here. So now we want to make it a different color, though. If it's a warning, or if this is a problem, we want to make it a different color. So let's say everything that is an info, let's keep that to be green. But everything that's a warning, let's make that red. Let's point it out to people that, hey, this is a warning. And so there it is. We've said, if it's a function, let's go back to the code and explain it. In line 2 here, we've said, if this skill matches a function, then make it a warning. Otherwise, make it info.
Is the question mark just like an if-then?
Yeah, exactly. It's technically called a ternary, but it's an if-then. It's saying true or false, true, false.
Can you do that in JavaScript, or is it specifically for this situation?
Say that again? Oh, you can do that in JavaScript. Yeah, it's available in JavaScript. Now, it might be easier if we move it into a function, and that might be a little more understanding, right? We can say is skill functions, right? This is just what we're naming it, and pass in skill. And then this logic here of is skill functions, that function doesn't actually exist yet. Where should it exist? Yeah, so then you can add that function, is skill functions. And hopefully this isn't confusing, but I just mean the name of it. Is skill name equal to functions. And then I have to go back in my HTML and say, I want to call the method is skill name equal to functions. And then I'm going to pass in skill. So that means my function declaration is, hey, I'm going to give you a skill, which I know is a string. And then what I want you to return is a Boolean.
You really want it to return a string, because it's changing the class names.
Yes, I want it to return string. Because what do I actually want out of that? I want out of that a actual class name. I want it either info or warning based on that. Good catch. And so I can say, I can move this into an if statement to make it a little more kind of obvious what's going on. And I can say, if skill to lowercase is equal to functions, then return warning, else return info. And this is doing the exact same thing as putting it in line there. And so it loops through all these and it says, okay, the first one loops, that's info. Second one, info. And it's every single time it's showing that to the screen, it's calling this function for every single one of those. And then that skill is running through for every single one of those. So that's what the book referred to as like attribute directive, or like setting an attribute on a HTML or on a TypeScript Angular component based on what's being passed in. Oops. I changed a ton of stuff. Make functions red. I would say that commit is terrible, right? Make functions red, it's kind of confusing because functions is like a loaded term. So a better way I could say that is I could revert that commit and I could go back and say, hey, you know, when the skill is equal to the word functions, then make it red. Got a question in the front. How do you revert a commit? If you want to revert the last commit, just do git revert unwanted commit hash. Let's try it.
Where do you get your commit hash?
Where do you get your commit hash? I'm just going to do git log too, because they're here. So here's my commit hash, where I said make functions red. And what did it say? Git revert. Ooh. No. Yeah, I want to revert that.
That's
Perfect.
it's waiting for you to close your editor.
Yep. I just had to save it. Boom. Okay. So if we go back now, it's gone. But so is all of our work that was there too. So we literally jumped back in time to our previous commit. We got rid of all of our work. We literally, reversed. So now we have to say, we have to do this again. Is function, what was our called again? Is skill name equal to functions? How about is skill name a warning? And then we're going to pass in the skill. And then we have to go over here, and in our skill list component, we have to mirror that by saying